Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm your host, Ryan Coonerty. As always, a reminder that An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports some of the most thoughtful and innovative voices in American politics. I've been a member of New Deal for years, both when I was mayor of Santa Cruz and now on the Board of Supervisors for Santa Cruz County. You can find us at newdealleaders.org or wherever podcasts are found.
Welcome to An Honorable Profession. I'm Debbie Cox Bultan, CEO of the New Deal. We're proud to support so many of the inspiring leaders you hear on this podcast. In this episode, I spoke with Nima Kulkarni, a trailblazing state representative from Kentucky. An immigration attorney, Nima shared her timely thoughts on the Biden administration's immigration reform proposals, as well as her work around police reform in Louisville in the wake of the Breonna Taylor shooting. Nima shared her family's immigration story and how that put her on a path to study the law, get heavily involved in her community, and eventually run for the state house, becoming the first Indian American elected in the state of Kentucky. Nima Kulkarni, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm so excited to talk with you. It's such a historic moment here in our country. We're talking just a couple weeks into the Biden-Harris administration, and you, of course, are a Democratic state representative in Kentucky, a very famously red state. So I thought I'd start by asking, just how you're generally feeling about where we are as a country, and in particular, are you optimistic that we can come together to tackle some of the big challenges that we're facing right now?
Yeah, I think optimistic is a very good word to use, certainly about how Democrats are feeling, even Democrats in Kentucky. I'm in Louisville, so it's a pretty Democratic city, which is rare. But I know that there is a lot of hope, and especially as an immigration attorney, there's a lot of hope among immigration advocates, given that Biden has made that his priority and had a lot of executive orders that he signed on day one. And in the first week, sort of reversing these horrible policies that we saw under the prior administration. So that plus, this new budget that was passed, or the Relief Act that was passed by the House with Vice President Kamala Harris as a tiebreaker, I think all of that is something that is very encouraging to us, and really fills us with hope that there's some movement that can be made in a more progressive direction.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And I definitely want to come back and spend some time talking about immigration and your work there. But let me ask you one other political question while we're on the subject of Kentucky. I think a lot of people, it wasn't too long ago, last November, were really hopeful that Amy McGrath might be able to unseat Mitch McConnell. She, obviously raised a ton of money. And at least from the outside, it kind of looked, like it might be competitive. I know you do have a Democratic governor, so you can win statewide in Kentucky as a Democrat. I'm just curious about your take on what's kind of the winning formula for winning statewide in your state.
Yeah. And, you can ask so many people, I'm sure this has been analyzed to death, why Mitch McConnell keeps getting reelected. I don't think you'd find a good answer. One of the things that was very interesting to me in this last cycle was the primary race, where it was Charles Booker and Amy McGrath. And you had this huge disparity in terms of the money that was raised in this war chest versus, somebody that basically closed a 50-point gap to less than 3 points on the day of the election with much less money and who started late. And there was a lot of momentum in that primary election. There was a lot of different sentiment throughout Kentucky. And I think one of the things that happened is Amy McGrath ultimately was trying to cater to Republicans. And Republicans in Kentucky are not going to vote for a Democrat, especially when you go out into the state. And what you have to do, not with the same message, I'll put it that way, not with the same old message. One of the things that we saw in the primary was Charles Booker going out to rural Kentucky and talking to people about his experience with poverty. For instance, he talked about the civil unrest and all the protests happening in the wake of Breonna Taylor's shooting. I think when you have a candidate that's able to speak to a person on a personal level about something that person has experience with or identifies with, that is the candidate that's going to win. And I think had the primary season been a little bit longer, had there been, not a pandemic raging, I think that we would have seen a different candidate. And I think that candidate might have had a better shot. I think there is a general feeling among Democrats in Kentucky that we have to get the conservative vote, that we have to get Republicans on our side. And either way, I don't think you get people on your side unless you're able to speak to them on a human level. And I guess that Mitch McConnell's able to do that. I have not personally met him, but I think if you have the right candidate, that's the thing. You have to have the right candidate to unseat somebody who's been in office for that long and is so entrenched in Kentucky politics.
Yeah, super interesting. I think people were really surprised by that primary result, actually. Thanks for reminding us about that. It wasn't on a lot of people's radar screens, I think. So super interesting. Let's go back to the new administration. And you mentioned out of the gate about immigration. Obviously, you are an immigration attorney, and we'll talk about that as well. But what is your take on the Biden proposal specifically? What is exciting to you about that? And I'd love to hear a little bit as well about some of the ideas you're championing around immigration at the state level too.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was exciting just to begin with is that he made it a priority. I think he signaled that this was a priority issue for his administration. Kamala Harris obviously is the first generation descendant of Black and Asian immigrants to be vice president, in addition to being the first female vice president. And I think that all of that speaks to this being an issue that they're not necessarily going to shy away from, and that they're going to try to meet head on, because it's, fundamentally an economic issue. It's a population issue. It's a workforce issue. And I think we have to be able to craft rational policies on a federal level. And, you mentioned state level, and we'll get to that, but it's really important that as a country, we recognize the value and really the fundamental foundation that immigration has laid for building this country. I think that is something that a lot of immigration advocates, we had a horrible time under Trump, because this was his signature issue as well, just in the opposite direction, trying to just shut down immigration, trying to demonize and vilify immigrants. And it's one of the things that we saw amplified is this rhetoric that's been around basically since the 1790s, that immigrants are criminals, immigrants bring diseases, and immigrants are here to steal your jobs. That narrative hasn't changed since almost the founding of this country. And so, it's interesting to note too that, in different administrations, in Democratic administrations and in Republican administrations, you don't really ever see Congress, or you haven't in decades, seen Congress take up comprehensive immigration reform. Just that whole concept has not been touched. And a lot of it, I think, is, you can chalk it up to political will, because immigration is a very hot button topic. You say the word, people have a lot of emotions about it, a lot of gut reactions to it. And it turns out your base. And it turns out your base, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. So, and it's unfortunate, but I think that's why we have not seen sort of these very simple solutions that have been analyzed by experts that have, we've looked at how much the cost is, what is the benefit to the country, and nothing is being done because politically it's expedient to have immigration continue to be an issue, as opposed to solved. and just be another pillar in our economy. And I'm hopeful that Biden's proposal focuses on that, right? So part of his proposal includes updating our employment-based immigration system, which is what I practice in. So I specialize in that area, and that is specifically dealing with employers, trying to get folks to come work for them, or it deals with folks trying to start businesses. And so I think once we are able to frame it a little bit differently and address any roadblocks that exist in our immigration system, that's a step forward. So one of the things he's proposing is getting rid of backlogs, for instance, in the employment-based immigration process. Those caps, there's backlogs due to these arbitrary caps that were placed back in 1990. So it's pre-Google, and it has not reflected, the tech boom at all. It has not reflected the major shifts that have happened in various industry sectors in terms of workforce needs. And I think that, just updating that system would have a huge impact on our economy. And once you start seeing the beneficial impact, it's much, much more difficult to get caught up in the rhetoric. So I'm hopeful that we start talking about immigration in the right way, and therefore the policies will kind of follow.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so important that the focus be, as you said, on the benefits of immigration. I mean, obviously the values that our country was based on, but also the economic impact it continues to have, for sure. And, when people think about immigration, Nima, they often think about it at the federal level. It's the system is a federal system. But we know there's a lot of stuff that can be done at the state and local level as well. Will you just talk a little bit about some of the ideas that you've been thinking about as a state legislator?
Yeah, so I've been discussing with for instance, our universities, because I deal with a lot of researchers, students, folks that have come here to get PhDs, they're patent holders, and we don't have a really solid way for them to stay here, to build their businesses, or to continue working for their employers. And so one of the things I've been working with our university system in Louisville, so my district encompasses the University of Louisville, which is one of two top-tier research institutions in Kentucky, University of Kentucky being the other. And, it's something that universities have not necessarily done. Some have not. University of Louisville has not. Really kind of trying to harness the global talent that they attract because of their research institution status. And the students they're able to attract from kind of all different walks of life, all different countries, studying different things, most of them STEM. So the majority of STEM students in our country are immigrants, and the majority of them are from India and China specifically. And, they come here, they develop a technology, they get a patent, and then our work visa situation is such that it's, a random computer generated lottery, and you may not get it, so they have to leave. So they take their patent and their technology and they start their, company somewhere else, most likely Canada, or their home country. And it's something that we are just continuously losing out on a daily basis because we're not being deliberate about it. And we're not doing it federally, but we can do it on a local level. And so that's something I'm really been kind of earnestly discussing this with our university to try to get something in place that helps these folks stay here. And that's kind of in the high skilled area, right? So these are highly educated people, high skilled workforce, mostly STEM. And I think you can look at the opposite as well in terms of unskilled labor. So you're not talking about professional positions. We have a lot of farmland. We have a lot of agriculture in Kentucky as well. And I've heard from employers, because they have a lot of undocumented folks working for them who cannot get driver's licenses. And so you have a situation where there's an employer who cannot function without the, his workforce or this one, very reliable person that has been there in their business. And they don't want them to go to the grocery store because they might get picked up by ICE because they don't have a driver's license. And that is the majority of the pipeline that leads to immigration detention and deportation. Is you get stopped for some reason. It may be a broken taillight. It could be something as innocuous as that. You don't have a driver's license. You don't have, auto insurance. And then you're, sort of detained. They find out you don't have papers. ICE comes, gets you, and you're put in immigration detention and then deported. Like, that's the pipeline. They are not rounded up necessarily all the time because of crimes. It's usually something, related to a driver's license offense. And you think about how many people and how many families are caught up in that, and how many employers are then impacted when their workers don't show up. And, having a driver's license be issued regardless of your immigration status is something that is a pretty simple fix, and it would lead to increased revenue in terms of fees. It would lead to safer roads because you would require auto insurance and driver's tests. And it's the rational argument against it does not exist, right? It's just basically, why would we reward them with driving privileges? And I think, again, if you're able to frame the conversation in a rational way, you don't have these arguments that are sort of gut reactions to how immigrants were portrayed, in the past.
Yeah, thank you for those. I know that you've really become a national leader on these immigration issues, and we're grateful at the New Deal to have you as an expert and sharing some of those ideas across the country. I'd love to turn to another issue that has been in the news this week. The mayor of Louisville, who's actually also a New Deal leader, Greg Fisher, he released the results of an independent top-to-bottom review of the Metro Police Department in response to the shooting of Breonna Taylor. And I know that's also an issue you've been really deeply involved with, both sponsoring police reform bill in the legislature as well as being part of the mayor's civilian review board. So I'm curious about how you got involved in that issue and how you're feeling about the report and a path forward in Louisville to heal the community.
Yeah. And I think, it was so interesting when the report came out because it was basically affirming what we all knew, that there was a disparate level of treatment by the police based on race in certain communities. And so, the folks that are down at Injustice Square, which is what they renamed Jefferson Square Park, because that's where the protests were, and they're still there in the wake of Breonna Taylor's death every single day. I think, those folks would tell you, we already knew this. We already knew what was in the report. And we've been calling on you to change your policies because we already knew this. We've lived with this for most of our lives. I think that it's empirical evidence, it's objective evidence that maybe some other folks in the community need to see, that do not understand what systemic racism is, that do not understand how deeply rooted this racial disparity is in terms of treatment by law enforcement, which can result and does result all too often in death for no reason. And so I think that what we can see here is that there is no path forward except to reform our police force, reform their training, reform how they police their communities, and really, really try to build trust with the community and the police officers serving them back, because that trust is gone. And I think that, if we're ever to get back to any semblance of confidence in our police force, we have got to rebuild that trust. And the only way we can do that is by giving the community some assurance, some real signs of progress in terms of police reform. That includes creating the Civilian Review Board. That includes making sure police training measures and the curriculum is completely overhauled. It also, is important to make sure that we root out any signs of white supremacy in our police force and not let that continue, not let it fester and not let it grow in the dark until it's too late. So I'm hopeful that while certain folks in our community already knew this, I think that this report will help other people understand that this is not something that's just something some activists are saying and dismissing it. This is a real empirical report that we all need to pay attention to if we're going to survive. And I say that quite literally because people are dying and people don't trust the police. And there's just no way to get past that until you address all the issues that have been identified in the report.
Yeah, it's a conversation happening across the country, isn't it? And it's such an important conversation to rebuild that trust. Nima, I know another topic that is important to you. You were a leader of a just announced package of bills and reforms called the Kentucky Maternal and Infant Health Project. I'm excited to hear more about that and what you're trying to achieve with that package.
Yeah. So as you mentioned at the beginning, Kentucky is a very red state, which means it's very pro-Second Amendment and it's very pro-life. And, one of the things that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of my colleagues that joined onto this project, is we don't talk about the right to reproductive health care, access to reproductive health care, the need for reproductive health care for women as a fundamental right, as a necessity. And it's always framed as an abortion issue. So it's just always about abortion. Everything that we've seen in the legislature, even during a pandemic, you've seen bills targeting providers, you've seen bills targeting nurses, families, anybody that sort of is involved on any angle. So it's kind of like death by a thousand cuts in terms of how do you get around Roe v. Wade, which is still the law of the land. And I think that this all kind of started with a conversation that was very discouraging because we were all like, oh, here's some more bills that we have to vote for that are not, not helping our constituents, that are basically just providing sound bites for, pro-life legislators. And we don't have a response, right? We don't really have a response like that, at least in Kentucky. And I think that, other states, other legislatures, maybe that conversation is a little bit more robust. And, at some point during that conversation, we decided that we just have to reframe the narrative. I mean, in Kentucky, we are at a 75 to 25 disadvantage. So we are in a super minority. I don't know what the word is for super minority, but we are just, we are
extraordinary minority.
Yes, it's there's very few of us. And so it's a good opportunity to reframe it because, there's just no way that we're going to be able to get the votes to, not pass something, to oppose something actively. And I think that's where this project came from. And my colleague, Representative Lisa Wilner, has very close ties with a lot of reproductive advocacy groups. And that's how it came about. We were like, here's what the maternal and infant health needs are in Kentucky. Here are some broad areas that we need to focus on, like access to care, like, incarcerated women. And that's something that I spoke about at the press conference that we had, because it includes immigrant women as well. And it disparately impacts Black and brown women. And it's just shocking. I mean, in Kentucky, a woman can be shackled while giving birth to a child. Oh. That child will be separated from her very soon after giving birth, regardless of if she's in there for a violent offense or not. And that's where we are. That's the state of, maternal and infant health for incarcerated women. And that's just one area, mental health care, postpartum treatment, the coverage, insurance coverage for any, supplies, any medical supplies, any medical care. There's just a whole slew of policies that we are not enacting that actually do impact mothers and infants. And so the sort of focus, the laser focus on this one issue of abortion has really dominated the narrative in Kentucky. And so this is an attempt for us to reframe that narrative in a more positive and a more beneficial and impactful light for the women of Kentucky.
Yeah, I'm really struck listening to you across these issue areas, actually, about whether it's immigration, we're talking about reframing that narrative and focusing on the economic impacts, or whether on the police reform, or even just healing the countries we started talking about with the new administration generally, your focus so much on recasting a narrative and telling the story differently in a way to bring people together. I think that's probably pretty instructive, as you said, being in a blue city in a red state, of how to think about bringing people together. It's a unique perspective. I'm really struck by. So thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to switch gears for a minute and talk a little bit about your own experience into public service. After all, this is a podcast called An Honorable Profession to talk about the value and importance of public service. So we talked a lot about immigration policy, and I obviously you are also an immigrant yourself, not just an immigration attorney. I believe you arrived here with your family from India when you were about 6. And I'd read that your father had been a high-level executive in the steel industry in India, and I think had some trouble initially getting work, buying a small grocery store, and eventually building a really successful business and working in the mayor's office. So I'm just curious about your own experiences immigrating to America as a child, and how you think that shaped your outlook as a public official.
Yeah, it's so funny to hear sort of your parent story in such broad strokes. But yeah, I mean, we came to Louisville. So this is the first part. We came from India to Louisville, Kentucky, right? We didn't go to New York. We didn't go to California. We went to Louisville, Kentucky, and we came here because my brother had learning disabilities. And there's a school called the DePaul School in Louisville. And my dad had somehow heard of them and had gotten in touch with the nun that had founded the school, Sister Ann Rita. And somehow they, but we didn't have, we got here, they enrolled him in school, and we all moved here so that basically my brother and I could have every educational opportunity that we could. And like you said, my dad was an executive, and we were leaving a pretty comfortable life behind in India just to sort of get this opportunity off the ground for my brother. And that's a pretty remarkable thing. And you'll hear echoes of this in pretty much every immigrant story, where you have this leap of faith. It's a leap of faith, but it's done with a lot of belief in yourself and your ability to accomplish, the thing that you're setting out to accomplish. You'll find that a lot of immigrants carry that with them, and they start their own businesses, even if they have jobs. They're entrepreneurs at heart, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, my dad came here. He had spoke the language, had a lot of degrees, could not get a job. Like, there was just no job available for whatever reason. I mean, Louisville back then was not necessarily as cosmopolitan. I say that relatively. There weren't a whole lot of immigrants, in Louisville, Kentucky at the time. I think there were maybe a handful of Indian families who had come over previously as physicians. So there's these odd waves of immigration that I always talk about too when I talk about immigration, the history of immigration to our country. So in the Indian context, you had, a wave of engineers come over like the 60s and 70s. You had physicians come over after that. And then you had all of these software developers come over after the tech boom in the 90s. And so we came in the middle of that, after the physicians, before the tech boom. And so it was an odd time, I'm sure, for Louisville, but yeah, couldn't find a job. And so they used their savings, they borrowed money, and they bought a corner grocery store. It was called 8 to 8. And it was in the heart of Germantown, the Germantown area of Louisville, which again, back then actually had descendants of the German immigrants that lived there. They still had some older German folks, and it was a very predominantly white area, predominantly older folks living there. And we just sort of showed up, this, Indian family that now ran the corner grocery store. And my parents had no experience running a grocery store, slicing deli meat, selling cigarettes. It was just not something they had ever done, but it put food on the table. And really that was probably one of the first times that I saw my parents, be accepted into the community. They couldn't pronounce their first names. They called my parents Sam and Sue, but they really embraced us. I mean, we never had to worry about, keeping a gun in the store. My brother and I delivered groceries to the neighbors who would, sometimes give us a quarter. And it was like such a big deal to me because, it's like the value of hard work. I mean, it sounds very cliche, but that's where I learned it. And I learned also sort of the need and the obligation that you have to give back to that community. So we didn't have a whole lot during those years, but I saw my parents help out neighbors, help out other families wherever they could and however they could. And so that was something that I just learned by example, and that sort of translated to, what do you want to do with your life? You're going through school. And I was like, well, I just want to help people. I don't know what that looks like. I tried medical school because, in the Indian community, it's very important, your education and sort of succeeding. And I tried medical school, but couldn't get through organic chemistry. So that was my Achilles heel there.
I love that.
And so I was like, I looked at the law because I had majored in English literature, mainly because I had a great English teacher in high school. And so I was, at some point in my life, I was like, I'm going to be a short story writer in Ireland, which is just a very, very strange, very specific thing to want to be when you're growing up. But somehow that led to me going to law school. I'm not even sure how all of it happened, but that the convoluted route was me ending up in law school in DC, because I wanted to get into policy more than the practice of law. And I was able to intern at Amnesty International, at Human Rights Watch, at the Government Accountability Project, and did a whole lot of clinical legal work. It was 700 hours or so. I went to a very progressive, social justice oriented law school. And, so I learned that you could, be a lawyer. It doesn't have to be about billable hours. It doesn't have to be about making partner. You could be a lawyer and help the community. And that to me seemed a perfect fit. There was a clinic in my law school. And that's really how I got into immigration law to begin with, is because I saw this very tangible impact that you could have on a person's life, beneficial impact that you could have on a person's life, helping them, get essentially to where I was, a naturalized citizen. And so, that's where it all came from. I mean, I can just attribute it all to the pathway that my parents laid for me, because they really taught me from an early age that you should give back. If you've got something and you're doing okay, you should help the community however you can. It doesn't have to be in a major way. And so that's kind of what happened. And I think throughout my work in immigration law, I saw, basically how much policy impacted immigration law. So, it changes. It changes with administrations. It changes with the stroke of a pen. It's different from other areas of law because it is so movable. It's so changeable. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on who has the pen in hand. And it's something that's very frustrating if it's somebody that's trying to, limit immigration, and it's, good and hopeful and encouraging when they're trying to expand it. Because, as a practitioner, you can see the beneficial impact that immigrants have on our country. And so the frustrating part is that everybody doesn't see that. So I think that, like a lot of folks, I saw what was going on with the Trump administration, and a year in, I guess I'd had enough. And so I looked around and said, what can I do? Because I can help people case by case, or I can try to do something on a broader policy level. And that's where I decided to enter into public office, viewing it really, and I still do, as a public service.
Yeah, let's talk about that decision. I do have to mention, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. It's so powerful. It's so inspirational. And I have to share that I interviewed another New Deal leader who also grew up in their parents' grocery store. There's something about, seeing the community from that vantage point and being such a part of the community that must inspire some public service as well. So I think that's just an interesting connection. But let's talk about your decision to run for office. You mentioned that, Trump being in office, you ran in 2018. Obviously, like you said, you've been really involved in the community in other ways and making an impact and making a difference. So, and you said that when you went to DC, you really thought you wanted to be in policy. So what was it that kind of pushed the button to decide to go from somebody who was going to work more behind the scenes to running for yourself?
So I saw that Kentucky, right? So I think that the Trump administration had this impact on states where they reacted one way or the other. California reacted one way. New York reacted one way. Kentucky reacted in a different way. They were very supportive of Trump, supportive of Trump's policies. And so you saw this uptick in the immigration rhetoric. You saw this uptick in folks feeling much more comfortable espousing their racist views and things like that. It was just not going in a great direction. And so I looked around at my representative, my state representative. I live in a district that's represented, by the way, congressionally by John Yarmouth, who is our favorite congressman. So I was not going to run against him. And he has been a champion of immigration policies. So we are very, very lucky to have him in Louisville. But, he's kind of like Louisville's a blue dot. I mean, he's it. And then you have, the antithesis in McConnell and Rand Paul and, everyone else in our congressional delegation. I think that I was somehow drawn to the state level. I didn't want to just focus on Louisville because Louisville is a unique place in Kentucky. And I really wanted to be able to impact policy on a statewide level. And so in a beneficial way. And I saw that people were voting against their self-interest. They were voting for policies that were ultimately harming them, economically harming them, on an individual and a family level, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, access to safe food and clean water, transportation so they can get to work, childcare. Kentucky ranks last in, any list that you can find in terms of how much we invest in our people. And the impacts are seen in our data. We have unhealthy people, we have sick people, we have a lot of poverty, and we have a lot of desperation because there is no pathway out. So you have industries that are gone, that are dying, like the coal industry. There has been no investment made in retraining those communities, for instance, in renewable energies. There is no investment in infrastructure. And these are important things to think about. And I thought my being there with my experience and my perspective on a state level and really focusing on progressive policies that would be able to help Kentucky in the years to come, even after I was gone. I think that's really what spurred me into running for office on a state level. And, at that time, the representative that was, in my district had been there for about 20, 21 years and wasn't very engaged, was not engaged in the district, was not talking about these issues, did not have any plans to address anything that's in our changing economy, in our changing district, in our Commonwealth. And so I think I saw that was a need that needed to be addressed. And that's why I ran for state representative of my district, District 40. And it's been a learning experience. It's been very, very interesting being a legislator in Frankfort, being the only immigrant, the only Indian. It's, I don't think folks know quite what to do with me. They don't know where to place me. And that's just been an interesting experience. But I think it's valuable to have somebody there espousing some progressive policies as rational, as not something that's radical pie in the sky. And it's been really helpful being a part of the New Deal and drawing on all of the best practices and amazing stuff that I see happening in other states. And I've definitely utilized that in introducing legislation and just having conversations trying to move the needle forward here in Kentucky.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that. I do want to stay on that thought. You read my mind about my next question. You really are a trailblazer in so many ways, and you mentioned it, but it's worth underscoring. I think you were the first Indian American to even run for public office at the state level in Kentucky, if that's correct, and then only the second woman of color in the Kentucky legislature. So I've been so moved, early this year with watching Kamala Harris get sworn in and how many people that's touched just to see that kind of representation. So, can you just speak a little bit more about, that experience that you alluded to and being a candidate and then a representative, that didn't look like, maybe people were used to seeing there, and how has that been for you?
It's really been amazing. I think that and I see that Kamala Harris, even when she was, when they were running, that she was the VP pick. That was exciting. I think that when they won, it was just such a historic moment for South Asians. I mean, just the levels of excitement, you couldn't believe it. And you look at the makeup of the cabinets and the folks that they have picked and appointed, and there's a lot of immigrants. There's a lot of immigrants, a lot of South Asians, a lot of people that care about the same issues, I guess, that we do. And I think that, that hope and that optimism that we talked about in the beginning, that has a lot to do with it. It's not just lip service. It's not just, the Biden-Harris administration saying, vote for me and we'll do this, and then they don't. There's actual structural changes that are happening in our government where you see people that are actually qualified for positions being appointed to those positions. I mean, that doesn't sound very radical, but after the last 4 years, it's refreshing. And it's a sign that I think we're getting back to normal. And the reaction, certainly in the immigrant community and the Indian community specifically has been just phenomenal. I was a member of the Emerge Kentucky group back in 2012. And that's a nationwide group that helps train Democratic women to run for office. And, in this class, there were 2 South Asian candidates. And I've seen so many immigrants, come up to me and say, hey, I'm interested in running for Metro Council, folks from the Somali community, from the Nepali community, from the Indian community. And it's just amazing. And they're mainly younger people, which is equally as exciting, if not more so, that these young people are so engaged that they're already planning, not like me with my sort of circuitous route to public office, like planning ahead so that they know, in the next 5 years, they're going to run for this office. And it's just astounding to see the level of determination, really, and engagement that just either my race and then Kamala Harris's election has created in Kentucky, and I'm sure it's happening nationwide.
Absolutely. It is just it feels like there's a sea change going on of types of people who are being elected that are just more representative. And I think it's going to really change the trajectory of this country. So it's just super exciting. I could talk to you forever, frankly, but I know our time is wrapping up, so I should. But I'd love to finish with just a question that I like to ask people. I'm always curious when we think about leadership and service, and I'm just so honored to work with so many of you who serve in public life. If there's a book or two that you would recommend that has meant something to you in terms of thinking about leadership.
So I don't really read leadership books. I don't know if other leaders do. Maybe I should get into it. But I have started, and it was not necessarily a resolution, but daily I will either read a TED article or watch a TED Talk on something. It doesn't matter what the topic is. And TED has a ton of videos, and they're brief. Some of them are longer and more in depth. And it's inspiring to me, to be perfectly honest, because what I think leaders need to do on a constant basis is learn. I think they need to constantly be observing, learning, really absorbing experiences and ideas so that they can then translate that into policies or initiatives. So that's what I've been looking at is really just TED Talks, one TED Talk a day. And
I love it.
And so that's an easy thing. I mean, it's much easier than reading a book. But I will say that on my bedside is a book, I think is called Human Behavior by Robert Sapolsky. He is a behavioral scientist. And so he has also a series of videos. And it's very interesting. It's interesting from an evolutionary standpoint to just understand why we do the things we do. Right? Because we think that we are making progress here. And it's interesting to know that we're really just animated by a lot of evolutionary impulses and biological impulses. And what can we do? What can we do with the knowledge of that? So I think that's also very interesting. And coupled with these TED Talks has been something that has helped me at least try to put some perspective in the legislation that I introduce and the conversations I have about policies, especially with people that we, that I may not agree with. So not necessarily a book or leadership book, but these two things have been helping me try to kind of keep focused on why I'm doing what I do.
I love it. It's fantastic. Thank you for that advice. Well, Nima Kulkarni, really appreciate you being with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks for listening to An Honorable Profession. Please subscribe to hear more amazing leaders. And keep asking your elected officials to be honorable. Boots Road Group produces podcast. I'm Ryan Coonerty, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars were used in the making of this podcast.